Gentle lady viewers and gentlemen viewers, good evening and welcome to this new episode of Historical Sketches, which is actually part 2 of the program with the title The Road to Damascus, in which I combine personal experiences as a medical interpreter with information gleaned directly and from the book Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime. In the previous episode, I used as an example a drug called gabapentin and began to uncover information that patients do not generally know, including falsified documentation, direct and indirect bribery, altering of doses during trial to facilitate approval, and so forth. And I will begin from that point. One layer of corruption as regards the essentially altered and falsified information of what a pill does to a patient involves the use of ghostwriters, that is, those who write articles assigned by authorities in the field written by someone else. And here is a quote from an internal company document appearing at a trial, after which Pfizer paid a fine of over $430 million for inappropriate use of the drug gabapentin. This document was generated inside Pfizer during the exchanges with the Federal Drug Administration in order to have the drug approved. And I quote, "We must have editorial control. We are using a medical agency to put the paper together, which we would show to Dr. Reckless." And incidentally, the name Reckless was the name of an FDA employee, Federal Drug Administration, and is not a joke. And quoting again from the same document, "We know that Allison, presumably I think some marketing manager of Pfizer, wants to make sure that we align publication messages with our global marketing efforts." And the medical writer asked Pfizer, "How do we make it," meaning gabapentin, "how do we make it sound better than it looks on the graphs?" And during the research that I started from finding out about the drug gabapentin, I discovered the existence of a Cochrane Center, so-called, that attempts to uncover some among the many frauds occurring during drug tests, trials, developments, studies, and approval. And this is the conclusion of the report arising from the Neurontin-gabapentin episode. Outright deception of the biomedical community, highly unethical, harmful to science, wasteful of public resources, and potentially dangerous to public health. As with the trials I reviewed, selective analysis can explain any positive findings observed. A finding, I think, that should give us pause. And still, in the context of the review of gabapentin, the Cochrane Center asked for some additional or clarifying information about the trials regarding the effectiveness of this drug or lack thereof. And after delaying the request for a long time, Pfizer finally replied, "We definitely would not supply any internal data. We all agree on that." Now, it is indisputable that the illegal and fraudulent promotion approved by some of the company's top executives did harm. An internal memorandum showed that doctors who attended dinners given by the company to discuss unapproved, not approved uses of Neurontin gabapentin wrote 70% more prescriptions for the drug compared to prescriptions written by those who did not attend. And the company even insisted on pressing doctors to use much higher doses of Neurontin than those approved, which means higher income for more harm. And I will jump to some of the conclusions from the book I quoted. They apply to the drug gabapentin that captured my attention, I explained in the previous episodes, but also to many other drugs. Off-label promotion, meaning using drugs for purposes other than those for which the drug has been approved, exposes patients to harms with no assurance of benefits. This criminal activity has increased and its victims have died, suffered heart attacks and strokes, had permanent nerve damage, or lost their eyesight. And in 2010, a jury found that Pfizer violated the Federal Racketeer Act that goes under the name of Ryko, and the company paid $142 million in damages. The jury found that Pfizer engaged in a racketeering conspiracy over a 10-year period. And by the way, Pfizer never told doctors or patients that its studies have shown that Neurontin gabapentin was no more effective than a placebo for some of the off-label uses. All this Neurontin information is thoroughly documented, otherwise it may be difficult to believe it. Still, it may not be improper to depress the arrogance of these haughty champions to show with how little justice they lay claim to victory and how much less they deserve to be applauded than despised. To lighten and at the same to reinforce the idea that a great part of allopathic remedies are administered and ingested because of patients' belief in authority rather than evidence, I will briefly describe another branch of medicine which is still trusted and believed in by a measurable percentage of the population, about 2% just in the United States. As a branch of medicine, it has, however, the considerable advantage of being harmless, however useful or useless it may be. And I'm talking about homeopathy. Regrettably, the meaning of homeopathy has converged with the practice of relying exclusively on herbal remedies and teas or tisanes for curing various ailments, which is something totally different. A brief excursus on the history of homeopathy should help, I think, to strengthen the combined claim of harmlessness and uselessness. Homeopathy was created in 1700 by the German doctor Samuel Hahnemann. It is possible that homeopathy would have been forgotten since long if the inventor had had a less exotic name, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, such as, for example, John Smith or similar. As an aside, in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and as late as the 19th century, remedies and medicines were kept in urns or containers, often carrying scripts in Arabic. For the exotic is a cousin of the miraculous. And in the Middle Ages, things Arabic had the halo of the exotic. Another example, unrelated to medicine, is this. For centuries, Germany was held in high regard for its supremacy in inventions and technology. And it was only after World War II that regard was transferred to the US. But I digress. Dr. Hahnemann came from the town of Meissen in Saxony, Germany, and knew that the medicines given to his patients did more harm than good, though possibly less than today's medicines. And in agreement with the pharmacist, who happened to be also his father-in-law, he thought of giving to the sick, and especially to those who thought they were sick, to give them simple, plain water without them being aware of it. And the doctor observed that as a result, patients were in general better off because, obviously, they did not suffer from the ailments caused by the side effects of real medicines, which inevitably brings to mind William Shakespeare and one of his characters in the play Timon of Athens. To this character, called Apemantus, a party-goer offers a glass of wine to toast the party organizers. Apemantus refuses, chooses instead a glass of water, and exclaims, "Here is that which is too weak to be a sinner, honest water, which never left a man in the mire." Back to homeopathy. So as not to create suspicions, the pharmacist kept the price of the prescriptions unchanged, or rather, he increased the price a little to make the operation more credible. And because he was also a churchman harboring some scruples within himself, he thought of adding to the plain preparations a very minute portions of a medicine selected at random, which was also a measure to prevent the malice of his colleagues. Because if the remedy didn't work, he could always say that he had made an error with the medicine measuring scale. To launch the product, Hahnemann coined the Latin slogan similia similibus curantur, that is, like is cured by like. A disease may be cured by something that can cause similar symptoms. To an observer that would make a polite but skeptical observation, homeopathic fans answer that homeopathy is good, and that's it. It is good for the body and for the spirit. It heals all diseases, gives vigor, and can even make one become more handsome. It also can change the existence for the better. Today, however, things are done in the sunlight and without deception. Patients know that they are drinking water, but they pay either for water already homeopathically treated or for do-it-yourself homeopathic water potentizing devices, as they call them. Devices that, without adding anything to the water, would transfer esoteric strength into it to make it special, or rather homeopathic. By the way, these water potentizers, as they are called, vary in price from $400 to $4,500. But returning to the main theme of the presentation, which is deadly medicines and organized crime, the number of medicines approved by the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, and subsequently heavily prescribed and promoted by the corporate media, and finally compulsorily withdrawn because of the harm and deaths that they procure to the patients, the number of such medicines is large. And just reading from a partial list would be depressing, because those who watch corporate TV may recognize some of the names by the constant hammering of them through earlier constantly repeated advertising. And we all know, have heard of, or are aware of the stream of lawsuits and class actions following the damage caused by medicines, pills, or interventions described as miraculous at their launch, only to be found later harmful, counterproductive, or actually deadly. One evident yet perhaps unavoidable paradox is that very many people may recognize the name of some pills because of the heavy advertising, but few, relatively speaking, know, unless directly affected, that the same heavily advertised medicines have been discovered to be harmful, deadly, and withdrawn from the market. Hernia, for an example, is a relatively common complaint among the patients I have been interpreting for, as I explained in the previous episode. In recent years, one hernia affecting women was referred to as Prolapse, and I still vaguely remember some TV ads promoting what were called pelvic mesh implants to resolve the problem. But it turned out that the mesh became embroiled, if that is the right word, became embroiled with the tissue that would grow around and between the elements of the mesh. And this led to incredible pain, lengthy surgery to disentangle the tissue from the mesh, and so forth. Some patients were left bedridden and unable to work. I found no statistics for patients who died from complications after the surgical removal. And finally, just this year, 2021, the courts dismissed Johnson & Johnson's related appeal, a name now, by the way, Johnson & Johnson, now familiar to most, and you know why, and the company was condemned to pay $2.6 million each, $2.6 million to each patient affected by the results of their miraculous remedy. Another case, GlaxoSmithKline in 2011 paid $3 billion in a fraud settlement involving having marketed a number of drugs illegally for, as I mentioned before, off-label use. For example, the examples are many, I only cite a few. Wellbutrin, an antidepressant, was marketed for weight loss. Another drug called Avandia, originally approved for asthma, was marketed for cardiovascular benefits, though it was removed in Europe in 2010 because of the increased number of cardiovascular deaths among patients who were prescribed accordingly. AstraZeneca paid $520 million in 2010 for illegally marketing the antipsychotic drug Seroquel to children, the elderly, veterans, and inmates for uses and not approved by the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, including aggression, Alzheimer's disease, anger management, anxiety, attention deficit disorder, dementia, depression, mood disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and sleeplessness. $520 million was small considering that the drug earned $4.9 billion in 2009. Johnson & Johnson was fined $1.1 billion in 2012, and the jury found that the company had downplayed the risk associated with its or her antipsychotic research Risperdal. Johnson & Johnson lied about the potentially life-threatening side effects of Risperdal, including deaths, strokes, seizures, weight gain, and diabetes. A world-renowned child psychiatrist from Harvard, incidentally, psychiatry is yet another lengthy, dramatic tale of woe, pushed the drug heavily to children and also extorted the company. He was furious after Johnson & Johnson rejected his request to receive a $280,000 research grant. The U.S. government started also a multi-billion-dollar healthcare fraud case, proving that Mr. Alex Gorsky, then Vice President of Marketing and now actual President of Johnson & Johnson, was actually involved and had first-hand knowledge of the alleged fraud. Considering the fact that Gorsky is master supremo of the major companies selling vaccines, you may draw your own conclusions. I could continue with the list of frauds and crimes and killings, only a small portion of which come to the visible surface or are prosecuted. But, as Shakespeare said, this would last as long as nights in Russia, when nights are longest there. Yet one major question is unanswered, or at least not sufficiently discussed, namely that, notwithstanding overwhelming evidence of massive errors, deaths, treachery, greed, corruption, crimes, and malfeasance, the medical pharmaceutical industry is one of the most nationally respected among all industries, respected and prosperous, competing with the military-industrial complex in wealth and income. The answer, probably we all agree, is both complex and simple. One answer is that an industry that succeeds in portraying itself as the friend, while being actually often the enemy of man, possesses all the tools necessary to dupe millions in believing lies, even when the lies are shown to be such beyond any reasonable doubt. It is an industry that embodies the tenets of the father of modern mass mystification, namely George Bernays, who incidentally, Bernays, was a nephew of Freud. The very Freud, in my view, at least in my opinion, being a stingy pervert who made a fortune by convincing mankind that we are all deviants. Speak for yourself, I would say. And the fruit of whose philosophy, of Freud along with the godfathers of cultural Marxism, are now in the open for all to see. Bernays' book on propaganda opens with the well-known quotations that it does not hurt to repeat. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. And I interject here, the statement is an open acknowledgement that for this individual, George Bernays, democracy is manipulation. And continuing with the quote, Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. At which many of us may reply that we know who are the men we never heard of, but cannot say it publicly to avoid retaliation. And incidentally, and in the context of the subject of health, Bernays headed the agency that for decades promoted the notion that tobacco was good for health. As we know, one of the successful tools employed by the communication industry, itself a product of the monopolistic control of society by those I hinted at before, is to defame, ostracize, and obscure objectors by branding them as conspiracy theorists, notwithstanding overwhelming and damning evidence regarding, as in this case, the sickness industry. On the other hand, as we know, the accusation of conspiracy is one of the preferred categories to which objectors are confined into by the paid-for fraudsters and sometimes by the intellectually obtuse. It is an equally appropriate classification for those unable or unwilling to argue for fear of power or because they profit from adhering to the dogmas of the sickness industry. And it is no coincidence that the term itself, conspiracy theorist, was coined by the CIA after the assassination of Kennedy to designate those who did not believe in the unbelievable proposition that the attack had been the work of a single man who had designed and carried it out in complete isolation. Moving to more recent times, and pessimistically speaking, a nation that believes that 19 drug addicts from Saudi Arabia did 9/11 perhaps deserves a so-called health industry that, in depth of deception and effrontery, competes with advantage even with the official story of 9/11. Still, belief injected by authority is not, in my view, a sufficient reason to explain the overwhelming trust bestowed on the sickness industry. Treating this subject even superficially would require several presentations, and therefore here is only a very, very limited outline. To start, it is a characteristic of the current communication industry, having reached the pinnacle of sophistication, to paradoxically convert individuals into crowds even when they are alone, behind the proverbial four walls, and sitting in front of television set. The individual at this point, however common or uncommon be his mode of life, his occupation, his character, or his intelligence, this individual, he himself, has been transformed into a crowd, and therefore he is in possession of a sort of collective mind which makes him feel, think, and eventually act in a manner quite different from that in which he would feel, think, and act if he were in a state of isolation. Therefore, instead of a he or she becomes one of them. It is them. Furthermore, however different may be their mode of life, occupations, character, or their intelligence, the fact is that these individuals, transformed into a crowd, acquire a sort of collective mind which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual would possibly feel, think, or act if she were in a state of isolation. The factors which determine these opinions and beliefs are of two kinds: remote and immediate. The remote factors are those that render crowds capable of adopting certain convictions and of being absolutely refractory to the acceptance of others. These factors prepare the ground in which are suddenly seen to germinate certain new ideas whose force and consequences are a cause of astonishment, though they are only spontaneous in appearance. the outburst and putting into practice of certain ideas among crowds present at times a startling suddenness. They come all of a sudden. This is only a superficial effect behind which must be sought a preliminary and preparatory action of long duration. One classical example are the writings of the 18th century philosophes, as they were called, that molded the minds and contributed to the triggering of the French Revolution. Those factors. The immediate factors are those which, coming on top of a long preparatory phase, in whose absence they would remain without effect, they serve as the source of active persuasion on crowds. That is, they are the factors which cause the idea to take shape and set it loose with all its consequences. The resolution by which collectivities are suddenly carried away arise out of these immediate factors. In our days, the belief in the consequences of the COVID mythology is or are an example of the startling suddenness following a preliminary and preparatory action of long duration. In the instance, the preliminary and preparatory action of long durations began long ago after the discovery of antibiotics. A discovery that, when considered in itself, almost partakes of the miracle. Also considering that, as it is well documented, happened literally by chance. Given the unquestionable and almost miraculous effectiveness of antibiotics in specific circumstances, it was a small step in believing that equivalent remedies could be found and applied to other complaints and diseases, leading subconsciously and eventually to believe in the myth of immortality. And I will stop here listing the causes and belief of crowds. However, when a belief reaches the level of the strength of a myth, conviction almost unconsciously transforms itself into a religion, a proposition, religion that can only be supported by faith. And faith reaches to the core of the mind-soul complex, if we can use this neologism, mind-soul complex. Therefore, any attempt, for example, to convince a believer in the COVID phenomenon of the remarkably mythological nature of the belief is perceived by the believer not as an attempt, but as a direct assault on his mind-soul complex. And he who tries to do so is instinctively perceived as an enemy, and no proof, no evidence, no logic will have any validity. And when a belief at large becomes practically a shared religion, individuals become crowds. Shakespeare had a deep contempt for humans turned into crowds, as proven in many quotations. For when man becomes part of a crowd, he becomes, as Shakespeare said, the beast with many heads, or the blunt monster with uncounted heads, or the fool multitude that choose by show. As for drugs in general, an epidemiologist and not subservient to the pharmaceutical gospel suggests that the label on drugs, or maybe even on vaccines, should read something as follows. This new drug hasn't been shown to be any better than currently available drugs, and we know much less about its harms, including the lethal ones, than we do for other drugs. There is no evidence that its higher price is accompanied by any therapeutic advantage. It is generally safer to take an older drug, as many new drugs are removed from the market later because of safety problems. Still, given the medical-oriented nature of this presentation, I will conclude with a quotation by Mark Twain, only slightly modified. Be careful about taking a medicine after your doctor has read on the box what indication is the medicine for. You may die of a misprint. Thank you for watching. Follow me on Twitter to receive notifications of other videos. And as always, may all the number of the stars give light to your fairway. Good night.